Good afternoon. I'm Gregory Allen, Director of the Wadhwani Center for AI and Advanced Technologies here at CSIS. Today we have a discussion with Professor Bradford of Columbia University about her new book, Digital Empires, which covers the growth of global regulation in artificial intelligence and other digital technologies, and describes it in terms of its geopolitical impacts. Professor Bradford, thank you so much for being with us here today.
Thank you for having me.
Before we launch into the book, I'd love to talk just a little bit about you. So how did you actually come to study the field of digital regulation, and what is your work at the Columbia University's European Legal Studies Center?
Yeah, so I study regulation more broadly, mainly economic regulation. I study the European Union and the EU's role in the world. So this is part of the sort of set of research projects that revolve around the kinds of regulations that really matter. That matters for the individuals, that matters for our societies, and that matters for the broader geopolitical landscape. So there really wasn't a sort of more important issue for me to try to get my head around than to study digital regulation.
So as I was reading the book, I realized that I was familiar with your earlier work, even though I didn't know it. And this may be true of the audience as well, because even those who have not heard of you have probably heard of a phrase that you coined, the Brussels effect. So this is something that you did more than 10 years ago at this point, but now when I have meetings with European government officials, it comes up all the time. So for those who are not familiar, what is the Brussels effect, and what were you trying to describe in this term?
Yeah, so it is the term that I coined in that article that dates back more than a decade, but then I wrote a book in 2020 with that same name. So with the term the Brussels effect, I refer to the European Union's unilateral ability to regulate the global marketplace. So the EU is one of the largest and wealthiest consumer markets in the world, and there are very few global companies that can afford not to trade in the EU. So as the price for accessing the European consumer market, these companies need to follow European regulations. But often it is in their business interest to extend that regulation across their global behavior and their global production because they want to avoid the cost of complying with multiple different regulatory regimes. So conforming to the most stringent regulation, which often is the European regulation, these companies can basically choose uniform production and serve the global markets. So that is the way why the EU, simply by regulating the single market, often then through this business interest of the companies, exerts global regulatory influence.
And so in that book, The Brussels Effect, you're talking about the implications of the EU regulatory regime on the broader world. This new book is looking also at the broader world and the other competing models with the European Union model. Mm-hmm. So what would you describe as sort of the main argument of this new book, Digital Empires?
Yeah, so the premise of this book is that there is now a growing global consensus that technology needs to be regulated. But I don't think there's any global consensus on what that regulation ought to look like. So in the book, I argue that there are three primary ways to regulate the digital economy. There is the American market-driven model, there is the Chinese state-driven model, and the European, what I call a rights-driven model. So the book lays out the foundations of these models, the implications of these models, and also then spends a lot of time explaining what happens when these different regulatory regimes collide in the global marketplace. And ultimately, it paves the way towards the questions that I take in the end of the book. Will one of these regulatory regimes prevail?
So in addition to the main question of the book, which you just described, you also introduced some analytical frameworks to sort of help people understand what this competition looks like. And one of those frameworks you introduced is the idea of vertical battles and horizontal battles. What are these?
Yes, so Gregory, I hope it analytically is helpful that we indeed think about these two sets of battles that we are witnessing. So one is the horizontal battle between the states, between the digital empires, between the US and China and the European Union. And then we have the vertical battles, because at the same time these states are battling one another, they are in their own jurisdictions also vertically battling the tech companies. So they are seeking to regulate the companies. So these two levels of the battles are crucial on their own right, but they also intersect in the ways that is strategically very significant. So if you think about the United States, the US is now reconsidering whether it also ought to start regulating the tech industry, whether it should be deploying its antitrust laws or privacy laws or content moderation laws or regulate artificial intelligence. But that vertical battle takes place in the shadow of the horizontal battle, in particular the tech war against China. And that introduces an element of restraint, because the US is concerned that if it is going to be too vigorous in its attempt to rein in its tech companies in the vertical battle, it is weakening the very asset that it needs in order to prevail in the horizontal battle against China. So we are seeing less committed regulatory response vis-à-vis the tech companies because the US government remains mindful of the big battle that is fighting horizontally.
And I think what you just described also plays out in the European Union as well. We'll get to this a bit more later, but in the AI Act debates, the member states of the European Union were thinking a lot about how the vertical battle and the horizontal battle interacted. But before we go there, let's think about, what is actually the mechanism of competition in horizontal battles. Most people, when you're taught Econ 101 and you're taught what is regulation and what is it for, usually it doesn't come up that it's a tool of geopolitical competition. So how does regulation actually affect geopolitical competition? What are the mechanisms that apply there?
Yeah, so regulation is a way to defend your strategic interests, but also then to try to defend your values and your view of the world. So if we start thinking about the transatlantic battles, there is this strong sense in the European Union that the US companies have overreached. The US tech companies have taken over the world. They are affecting European societies and the lives of European individuals, and not only in beneficial ways. So there is now an attempt to then rein in those companies and assert the state power back in the marketplace, so that the US tech companies would not be able to abuse their dominant market position, exploit the private data of Europeans, or then use their position as platforms to moderate content in the ways that then poses a threat to European democracy. So then the Europeans are asserting their regulatory powers, which leads the Americans to often think that, look, it's not our companies that are overreaching, it's your regulators that are now entering into our territory and are defining then how our companies ought to be conducting their business. So there's a lot of battles there that is about what kind of digital society we ought to witness in Europe, and what is the operating space of these American companies, and who gets to decide. In the US-China setting, the battle is even more about geopolitical leverage. So it is a battle about technological supremacy, economic supremacy, geopolitical, and even ultimately military supremacy. So there we see a massive arms race between the US and China, in order then to make sure that both are technologically sovereign to the extent that they cannot dependent on one another, and then ensure that they are really at the cutting edge of development of technologies like AI, which requires them also to then lead in semiconductors and other strategic technologies. So it is also a strategic contest that is fought mainly through regulation. So it is the contest that has triggered export controls as the US is trying to prevent China's access to those strategic technologies. We see investment controls, attempts to limit both inbound and outbound investment. And we see a new era where even the United States, no matter its commitment to market forces, is very eager to also subsidize its critical technology industries, and thereby shaping the marketplace. So these are some of the ways how the technology regulation is really shaping the geopolitical contest, some of the most important strategic contests of our era, but also then shaping just the general digital environment within which all of us as digital citizens are interacting.
So you described the sort of two main tools as one, having a looser regulatory regime, which in the minds of many US policymakers, what is sometimes referred to as a light touch regulatory approach, is a tool of also promoting the development of that industry in addition to other mechanisms such as subsidies. But focusing on the EU for a second, in the book you argue that this is not necessarily the case. You say in the book that the main criticism of the EU model, which is that, quote, the heavy-handed approach towards the digital economy increases the costs of doing business and dampens innovation in the sector. But you further say that this can be true but does not have to be true. So what did you mean by that? What are the circumstances in which you can have sort of effective digital regulation but not necessarily at the cost of innovation?
Yeah. Yeah, so the book certainly doesn't endorse that all regulation is beneficial, but it tries to challenge this very persistent narrative that there would be inevitably a negative relationship between tech regulation and innovation. So often there's a very simplistic narrative that the Americans are innovating, whereas the Europeans are regulating. So you look at the light touch, as you say, of the American digital regulation, and you look at all those successful tech companies that are emanating from the US. Then you look at the European tech scene, and I am worried. I think one should be worried. There are no European Googles and Metas and Apples and Microsofts. So in many ways, Europe is behind in technological development. So it may take you a while to name a European tech company, but I think everybody's pretty quick to name the GDPR. So Europe is known for its regulation. So this has then nurtured this notion that somehow the Europeans are not innovating because they are regulating. But I think there are other issues that are explaining why there is this gap between American and European innovation. And it has very little to do with regulations like the GDPR. If you look at the difference between the US and the EU, what I see first and foremost is that the Europeans have failed to integrate a digital single market. It is much harder for a tech company to grow in the EU and scale in the EU because you face a fragmented market across the 27 different regulations, linguistic barriers, and so forth. That's not the problem in the US. The second, there's also no deep integrated capital markets union in the EU. So it is much harder for the European tech companies to fund their innovations in the EU. So again, that to me is a much more important consideration explaining why we don't see the same kind of tech success. So the European tech companies, they normally do pretty well in the first few funding rounds. But as soon as they need more capital, they need to turn to American venture capital or they are acquired by the European tech giants. So I think there's two other issues that I would want to raise, and I want to spend a little moment here because I think it is really, really important. So the third, so digital single market, the capital markets. Third is bankruptcy laws and attitudes towards risk-taking. So the Europeans have some of the most punitive bankruptcy laws in the world. So failure is often almost fatal in Europe, whereas it is just a rite of passage in the US. It's built into this Silicon Valley and venture capital model in the US. So you try very hard, you take risks, and sometimes you fail. And what happens then? You raise more money because it seems to be that you're working on really big things and you're very ambitious. In Europe, that just doesn't happen. So I think we would need to change the conditions under which the European entrepreneurs can take risks. It's absolutely crucial for disruptive innovation. And then the fourth, Gregory, and this to me is fundamentally important. You cannot create the top innovations if you don't have the innovators. And here again, the US has a tremendous advantage over the Europeans. The US is recruiting from the global talent pool. It is a magnet for immigrants that are coming to the US to benefit the American innovation base and the labor market. So if you look at just over $1 billion startups in the US, over half of them have an immigrant founder. And if we for a moment just look at the household names, the tech companies and their founders. So Steve Jobs of Apple is a son of a Syrian immigrant. Jeff Bezos of Amazon, second generation Cuban. Elon Musk of Tesla, South African. Sergey Brin, the co-founder of Google, is Russian. Eduardo Saverin, the co-founder of Facebook, is Brazilian. And I could go on. This is not the story of the GDPR or the idea that if the Europeans now just scrapped the AI Act and decided that we don't need it, somehow a few years from now, all those AI companies would emanate from Europe. So I'm inviting more of a nuanced conversation of what are these foundational elements of a thriving tech ecosystem so that we don't get all fixated on this idea that more regulation, less innovation. I think the story is more complicated than that.
So the book came out late last year, and since then, even since the time period in which I assume you were writing the book, there's been quite a lot going on in the European digital regulation space. First, you have the DSA, the Digital Services Act, which is now in its implementation phase, and it's a little bit more centralized. The European Commission has a staff, I want to say, of about 100 people, and they're specifically going after this criticism that you just laid out, which is the fragmented market. So whereas the GDPR, much more of the regulation is being handled by the member states, and the DSA, it's a bit more centralized. But then we also have the EU AI Act, which by all accounts, it's really just in the translation phase now and is going to become law just in the next 60 days or so. And in the past few months, there's been a real scramble around the EU AI Act to make it more friendly to European tech companies. In particular, this firm Mistral, which French President Emmanuel Macron has sort of identified as a European AI champion, was held up as an example of a company that we don't want this regulation to stifle these exciting new AI startups in Europe. And so I'm curious, what you make of these two new developments. One, is it still fair to say that EU is acting in the rights paradigm that you articulate in the book, or are you seeing signs of a sort of turning ship in the EU approach?
So I would still describe the AI Act very much as part of the European rights-driven regulatory model. It is still reflects the set of values that the Europeans believe that we cannot leave the tech companies to their own devices. Self-regulation is not enough to keep the harmful development of AI in check. So it does impose a series of very, I would say, severe obligations on tech companies backed by real penalties.
6% of global turnover
that
in some
is
cases.
A lot if you think about the kind of revenues that we talk about in case of these leading AI developers. And there's going to be a set of AI systems that are going to be altogether prohibited from the EU. And then a lot of those high-risk applications that are subject to a set of regulatory requirements. So I think it's serious regulation, it's ambitious regulation, it is a very broad, far-reaching regulation, and I think it will have the potential to fundamentally shape the marketplace. But you are absolutely right that the Europeans are also facing this balancing act, that they realize that they need to make sure that any technology like AI, which has just tremendous positive potential, but also non-trivial harms that are likely to materialize, in addition to harms that may not be as likely, but that are potentially existential if they were to materialize. So it is a real balancing act. And I think, like in any democracy, there is a lot of disagreement, there is debate, and there is a lot of searching of that right balance. And I think towards the end of the legislative process, the French in particular, alongside the Germans and Italians, were having second thoughts as to how far-reaching the regulation ought to be, especially when it comes to generative AI that would affect some of the leading, most prominent or potentially exciting startups emanating from markets like France. But I think this is now part of a broader conversation that the Europeans are having about regulation of technology. Because alongside their commitment to protect the fundamental rights of the individuals and democratic structures of the society, there is this emerging notion that the Europeans ought to first and foremost worry about their strategic autonomy, their digital sovereignty, their technological self-sufficiency. So there is a concern of the Europe's place in the world that is no longer really conducive to global supply chains and conducive to cooperation. That's the territory where the Europeans are very comfortable. But the US-China tech war is heating up, and it is unsettling the Europeans and making Europeans very concerned on their dependencies on both the US and China. And the French in particular have been now cultivating this conversation that the Europeans need to invest in their own capabilities. So we would need to have European national champions so that we can better compete with the American and Chinese leading companies. And there is really now this kind of a tug of war in Europe between those who say that, look, we really cannot go too far in the industrial policy route. We need to be committed to global markets, open markets, integrity of the single market, and then the more sort of French narrative that, look, we need to think about the security implications. We need to think about our economic security, and we need to be prepared to then prop up some of the national companies, and also then fight the tech war pretty much in using the same tools that the US is now using. So this is, I think, now a big sort of decision for the Europeans to make on the direction of its digital agenda, between this commitment to rights, but at the same time growing, for understandable reasons, the growing concern about the security of the Europeans.
And so I want to get to the US-China aspect of this in a moment, but before we do, let's talk about the vertical, in using your framework, competition within the United States. We talked a moment ago about how there's some indications that the EU is not changing their approach, but sort of modifying their approach. And I want to ask if it's your sense that the United States is doing the same. You've seen the Federal Trade Commission under this Biden administration be more interested in antitrust type arrangements than has been true in probably decades in the United States. And at the same time, the Biden administration has put forth an executive order on artificial intelligence that I've heard described repeatedly as the maximum that the White House could possibly do without a new act of Congress.
Yes.
So there's more interests in regulation than there has been in a while. How do you react to these sort of developments?
Yeah. So there certainly is I could even say sea change in the conversation about tech regulation in the US. So the Americans are increasingly losing their faith in tech companies. I think the tech companies have failed us repeatedly and spectacularly, to the extent that I think the American people are really having second thoughts on this idea of techno-libertarian worldview, whereby we would let this techno-optimist notion lead and guide our regulatory response. So if you look at the public opinion surveys, there is much more appetite for regulation in the US. And even if you look at Congress, this is one of the very few bipartisan issues. So the Congress can't really agree on anything except on two things. First, that China is a problem. Both Republicans and Democrats seem to concede that's the case. And second, that the tech companies have become too powerful and we would need to regulate them. So there is a very different conversation going about, whether it's about privacy or content moderation or AI or antitrust. And I think this executive order on artificial intelligence really reflects that. It is adopting the kind of rhetoric that is very similar to the rhetoric in the EU. But I think we still need to draw a comparison that what the executive order is seeking to accomplish is very different from the EU's AI Act. Many of those commitments are still non-binding, so there's going to be a lot of studies and report and building the capabilities for future regulation, but it still falls short on the kind of regulatory objectives and the ability of the AI Act to shape the marketplace. And I think that the truth remains that even though there is a different conversation about technology, the US Congress is far from being able to actually translate that shifting sentiment into actual legislation. So I think it still remains to be seen how much those FTC and DOJ enforcement actions will shift the landscape, because the courts may not be ready for an antitrust revolution, and whether any of those numerous bills introduced in Congress will ultimately amount to a legislative change in this country.
And so now turning to China, the old cliche is that the US can innovate but not regulate, the EU can regulate but not innovate, but that miraculously China can do both. Do you think there's any truth to this?
I think there's truth to that in many ways, because if you look at China's record in terms of innovation, it is impressive. So there's a lot that China has done that I think has really challenged this notion that may be very hard for us to admit is that they've really shown to the world that freedom is not necessary for innovation. They have managed to create a thriving tech economy without being free. And I think that is a really big challenge for us to come to terms with. The second, they also have shown their capacity to regulate. So there was for a long time this philosophy among the Chinese government that we do need to let this tech sector grow. There was very little intervention. But very recently, we reached the point when these tech companies became so large that they started to overshadow the Chinese state itself. And that just was no longer acceptable. So in the authoritarian system, you can make very fast moves. It is much harder to produce regulations and legislate in the United States or enforce those legislations in the EU. But if the Chinese government decides it's time to crack down on big tech, it is time to crack down on big tech, and that is what we have seen. So now, Gregory, I think the real test is whether China will continue to innovate in this new, much more uncertain regulatory environment, where the companies have had very little time to adjust to regulation that has been extensive and that has been very, very fast. But in many ways, I think China has been impressive. If you look at what they've done in the domain of AI, they have produced already an extensive set of regulations in the AI space. Yet we can also look at what they have innovated. And I think right now one could say that, yes, China seems to be generating both. It's generating innovation and it is capable of regulating.
And I think there's perhaps also some important shifts going on in China, just as we were talking about for the United States and the European Union. Namely, the most recent round of regulations has frequently been described as a tech crackdown. And I think this was a little bit less about ensuring that market incentives towards competition are properly aligned and more about asserting political control. And that appears to have borne out in a capital flight out of the Chinese venture capital ecosystem and the technology ecosystem. Do you think that this is likely to be a long-standing phenomenon, or do you think that this is more of a temporary blip and that we'll get back to a more innovative China despite the regulatory pressures in the near future?
So it is a real balancing act for the Chinese Communist Party. So there is a genuine commitment to this idea of common prosperity, that the idea that we do need to think about not just how much wealth these tech companies generate, but how that is spread more equally across the society. They are rethinking of what kind of innovations these tech companies ought to be focusing on. They need semiconductors more than they need social media and entertainment. So there has been a heavy-handed approach to try to steer the innovative activities. And also, as you say, to ensure that these companies remain beholden to the government and not the other way around. So I think it's very clear message to these companies who is in charge in China. But at the same time, even the Chinese Communist Party is not unconstrained. It may have the powers, it has the ability to be very decisive, but it needs economic growth. It needs it for external reasons and for internal reasons. For external reasons, without the growth of its tech companies, without the continuing, thriving, dynamic, innovative tech economy, it is prone to lose the tech war, and it cannot afford for that to happen. But also internally, the legitimacy of the Chinese Communist Party is vested in this idea that they do need to continue to produce growth and development, and the individuals, the Chinese citizens, need to benefit from that growth. So there is also, we saw that they were cracking down very fast and extensively, but then dialing back already to make sure that they are not overdoing it. They can't afford all that capital flight. They can't afford to see that innovation not continue. So in many ways, I predict that we are going to see these pendulum swings when we are escalating, then we are de-escalating when it comes to the regulatory assault against the tech companies, so that the government is what it's trying to do. It's trying to have it both ways. So it wants to retain control, but it does need to make sure that these companies have the space to innovate.
There's a famous phrase going around on Chinese social media that is, there are 7 sparrows in a tree. You shoot one, how many sparrows are left in the tree? And obviously the answer is zero, because the other ones flew away in fear. And that's sort of describing the current moment of the tech crackdown. My colleague here at CSIS, Scott Kennedy, he often says that the Chinese government, whenever there's some kind of problem in the economy, they will announce a 20-point plan for this or a 50-point plan for that. And his prescription is a 1-point plan, which is genuine rule of law in regulation. One of the challenges of Chinese regulation from the perspective of a technology entrepreneur is that it can be retroactive. You can be guilty of violating a law before it was the law in China. And that is really difficult for entrepreneurs to get through. And I think it sort of, at least in my mind, describes why the current moment is different unless the Chinese government changes pace, because the sort of current approach is not the one that entrepreneurs or investors are going to want to be doing business in.
Absolutely.
So now I want to talk about this competition, because what we were just describing is what China is doing to itself, but earlier you were talking about what the United States is doing to China. So let's go there. Let's talk about one of the most dramatic changes in this competition was the Biden administration's October 7th, 2022 export controls. These export controls sought to restrict the exports of semiconductor chips for AI technology, as well as the chip-making equipment for creating such chips to China. I personally have argued in many CSIS reports that this was a landmark in the US-China relationship. Do you agree?
I do think it was a landmark. I think it is a real shift from the kind of United States position that has always been embracing free markets and free investments. We moved into a very different territory where we're leaning very heavily to national security as the strategic imperative that then does force the US to make compromises when it comes to commercial opportunities that its tech companies are enjoying or have been enjoying in China. So we certainly see a very different approach towards the regulation and very drastic tools that the US is resorting to. But even there, something that I discuss in the book, that we are seeing both pressures for rivalry and for restraint. There's only so far that US can go with the export controls, because again, it is eroding then the very profits that its own tech companies need to develop AI and other critical technologies. So the US continues to face pressures by its own companies that continue to lobby against many of these export restrictions, that continue to try to find ways around these restrictions. So there too, we have not seen the kind of total export bans. I don't think we are on our way to full decoupling of the tech ecosystems. Especially if we think about semiconductors. The industry is so intertwined, it's complex, and it's impossible for any player to fully reshore those supply chains and start producing all elements of that supply chain domestically. So there needs to be some continuing engagement with the Chinese market, but at the same time, that engagement is going to be shadowed by this continuing pressure to also continue the tech war. I don't think this is the last that we've seen when it comes to export controls or pressures to dial up investment controls. But at the same time, I think I take some comfort if you think about some of the most drastic scenarios of where this could lead us, is that both parties also have the incentive to engage in moderation and restraint.
I think one thing I've observed in dialogues with companies in both the United States and Europe is the one-sidedness of the rhetoric that is made public versus the rhetoric that is in private. If a company goes forth and says, we don't like the Biden administration export control policy, the Biden administration is not going to raise taxes on that company that day as punishment for going off message politically. But in the case of China, any company that comes forth and says, we love these export controls and we hope that the Biden administration does it 10 more times, they can expect to be in Chinese courtrooms the next day. And so there's this really difficult situation, and politicians tell me about it too, which is they have so many companies that come to them to complain about how they're being treated in China. The same is true in Europe, which go to their politicians and express the same concern. And so few of them are actually willing to say so publicly. So the voting public gets this really asymmetric balance of rhetoric, which I think makes it hard to make informed decisions.
No, and I think that is, I think what one would expect in many ways. This is a very nuanced dance that you are engaged in as the government official in charge of these policies. And I think they cannot remain immune to the corporate interests. They do need to hear that message. They do need to weigh that message. But at the same time, there is a lot of currency in this rhetoric that is very hawkish on China. So the American public does not want to hear that we are on the verge of losing or we are backing down in our attempt to make sure that we rein in the Chinese attempt to compromise our national security. But I think the reality behind that rhetoric is very complicated. It's much more nuanced, and we see the different kind of rhetoric. But I think you're very right to point out how asymmetrical this is. So in China, it is the operating space for either Chinese companies vis-a-vis their own government or the American companies vis-a-vis the Chinese government is very different to what kind of leverage the corporations can exert in the US. And something we haven't yet touched upon, but when the US government has tried to restrict TikTok's operations in the US, TikTok can resort to independent courts in the US, our rule of law system, and challenge the executive action in the court. And they've done it successfully. That is not an option for an American company that is unhappy with its limited access to exploit the Chinese market. It cannot go to Chinese court and ask them to review the actions of the Chinese government. So their option is then to go to their own government. They go to the US government and explain how difficult it is for them to penetrate the Chinese market. And then it is up to the negotiations between all the tit for tat, the rhetoric and the actions that are going on between the US and China that will then shape their ability to ultimately be able to take advantage of that market.
Yeah. So despite these October 7th export controls and other moves, you argue in the book that, quote, the US is losing the horizontal battle to China and the EU. Why do you think that is?
So if we take a step back from the tech war conversation that we were just having, where I think there are very few winners, there are more losers in the tech war. But if we think about broadly what is happening, if we think about these three different worldviews on the digital the world, so the market-driven, the state-driven, and the rights-driven, I do believe that the American vision, the American set of values, this idea that we can leave it for the markets and the free internet and free innovation will ultimately provide the path to victory, I think it is fading. In many ways, the US market-driven, techno-libertarian worldview is now coming to an end. So there are very few individuals or governments around the world that anymore trust the tech companies' self-governance. So I think in many ways, these tech companies have become vested with so much power today that they cannot anymore responsibly handle that power. And that has now led to a severe backlash in the European Union that has been leading the charge against these tech companies, but also in many other parts of the world where the governments are moving away from this model of self-regulation and then starting to regulate the industry. So in that sense, when in the democratic world, when the governments are moving away from the market-driven model, they are coalescing behind a variant of the European regulatory model. But at the same time, a set of countries, and not a small set of countries, find the Chinese model very appealing. So for them, they don't trust the US tech companies. They look at what China is doing and they are in agreement with the kind of authoritarian control. They don't want the European rights. They don't want to preserve democracy. They like the idea that they accomplish a variant what China is accomplishing. So in that sense, the winners with the retreat of the American market-driven model are in the democratic world, the European model, and in the authoritarian or authoritarian-leaning world, the Chinese model.
So the book is obviously still quite new, but even since the book's writing and publication, there have been major movements around the world, especially on regulating artificial intelligence. So if there was to be a part 2 of this book, what do you think you would be finding?
So obviously, since I wrote the book, and book is not just about artificial intelligence, it's about content moderation and privacy, and it's about antitrust and many other domains of tech regulation. But AI has really kind of taken on with the force and dominates many of the conversations. So the part 2 might really examine the way this framework helps us understand what's going on with AI. And I think already now we are seeing elements of that. So the US has been leaning very heavily in the markets and making sure that it leads in AI innovation. The Europeans have been at the forefront of protecting the rights of individuals and preventing those harms from AI from materializing. And China is approaching AI with its view that we do need to control the downside. So for instance, AI cannot undermine the censorship regime. You cannot have the variants of the ChatGPT, the generative AI, generate content that would undermine and contradict the message of the Communist Party. At the same time, AI is a tremendous opportunity for surveillance. China leads in facial recognition. So in many ways, I think these alternative futures, these visions of the digital world are already playing out in the AI space. But I think there will be so much more to write about AI. So I think that the next variation of this book would probably go deeper even into the AI. But I hope and I do believe that the framework is there and that is already helping us understand. But maybe if I answer what I think the one or big chapter of that book would be, is probably how AI impacts democracy. Because I am very concerned. This year, we are seeing over 50 national elections around the world. We already are extremely concerned about the disinformation, undermining the integrity of those elections. Now we have AI as the new tool to amplify potentially that disinformation, distort our sense of reality and our ability to make informed choices in that electoral context. So that really worries me. So in many ways, I think our optimism about technology as a tool for shaping our society in beneficial or harmful ways will play out in the context of the elections in this particular year. So that is something that I am watching very carefully and I would say with a great amount of concern.
Well, while we wait for your next book, we've got this one, which is really a terrific piece and a contribution to the scholarship on this area. Gave a lot of tools to help think through the topics, as it also gave evidence for how to think about those topics. And I'm especially glad to announce that I think it was a Financial Times Best Book of the Year for 2023, and really just an exciting piece of work overall. So, Professor Anu Bradford, thank you so much for coming to CSIS.
Thank you, Gregory, for having me. Real pleasure.
All right, thank you. And this concludes the event. Thank you all for joining us.